Welcome back, everybody, to Boz to the Future. I am your host, Boz. It is great to be back for our second season, and I am thrilled today to be joined by John Carmack, former Oculus CTO, now heading up AGI at Keen Technologies, a man who really does not need much of an introduction. I want to say that the first programmer's name I ever knew was John Carmack when I was a young programmer, aspiring programmer growing up. I usually ask the guests to introduce themselves. What do you think is the most important thing for somebody listening to this to know about you, John?
Well, I'm really deeply an optimist. I mean, I'm on my sort of fourth technical arc through my career after 3D video games and aerospace and virtual reality and now artificial intelligence. And I see more opportunities and more just chances for things being amazing than I ever have. I think that the present is more amazing than most people give it credit for, but the future is going to be even better.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, you talk about these multiple careers. You gave some great kind of viral advice on Twitter this week, talking about don't focus so much on being a programmer, so much as what it entails. And that is really kind of the arc for you. Like you happen to have been a phenomenal, maybe the world's greatest living programmer, but that wasn't the point. The point was the things that you were building at each stage. And you're back at it again with AGI. Actually, I'm going to start there. The whole premise of this podcast is most podcasts kind of go very broad and not very deep. And that makes sense. You want to kind of give the guests an easy time and you're just covering a breadth of topics, and it's quite interesting. I have tried with this one to go deeper for the listeners who want to understand more. We'll talk about VR later because we got to give the people what they want. But I want to start with AI, which is where you have pivoted your considerable talents lately. Talk to me about your vision for Keen and what led you to it.
So we're a really small company, and I've been trying to go out of my way to not really talk about it very much because, we have funding. I've got the employees that I want. Don't have a product to sell, and I don't want to be an AI pundit. So you're kind of ambushing me on this, but we'll
okay.
So
we won't go too deep on this.
Yeah, it's okay.
We'll go to VR sooner.
But yeah, it's been an interesting arc because I've been so deep in VR for the last decade, basically. But things were clearly happening in the machine learning and AI space over the last several years, and really it's been quite interesting where the modern era of VR and the modern era of AI both started almost exactly a decade ago, and it's been interesting kind of contrasting the paths that the different things have taken. But AI has clearly reached sort of a real critical mass where it is in the public consciousness, it is taking off. And there's all these practical things, all the companies that are being founded to do AI stuff. And it's almost just a Silicon Valley joke about, well, we're going to do this with machine learning and we're going to add this to it. But when you get down to it and you look back at sort of the primordial desire of artificial intelligence, all the way back to like the late 50s meetings where the term was coined, and this idea that unless you're some kind of a dualist, thinking that there's a separate spirit or a soul from the body, we are biological machines. Anything that our brains do, we should be able to simulate in software and hardware. And if you can do that and you can wind up doing the things that make humanity great and wonderful, and then possibly run them with greater breadth or depth or speed or any of these other things, then it is transformative in a way that almost, beyond almost any other technology that you can imagine. And when I started looking at this seriously a few years ago, I did really get this sense that we are on the cusp of this. And of course, people have thought that since the 50s. The joke was back in that original Dartmouth meeting that they thought it's like, wow, we could make great progress in a couple summers with a few grad students. And It's been a running joke that, it fails to deliver over and over. But there's been an awful lot of goalpost moving there. And, at the risk of being a butt of a future joke, it does feel like this time it's different, that we really are at a point where the big breakthrough is close. It's inside. We don't have a direct line of sight. Nobody knows what to do about it, but it feels like we're about there on the hardware capabilities for it, which is one of the grand lessons of the last decade. It didn't matter how smart you weren't going to build an AGI in 1990. It just wasn't going to be possible. But it feels like we are at the point where it's possible. Today, nobody knows exactly what needs to be done, but it really does feel like it's this small handful of insights away from where we are now to this sort of human level general intelligence. And that's something that people that aren't really fairly deep in the trenches don't realize, where the only difference between a decade ago when AI was kind of a joke and where it is today, where people are afraid it's going to take over the world and be some extinction event, it is this handful of really simple insights in the technical levels of the way these are implemented, insights about architectures, activation functions, training procedures. And each of these is simple enough that you can write them on the back of an envelope. They're not like super deep. I mean, yes, you do read papers that have 100 pages of really dense mathematics, but then you summarize it all down into the 2 sentences that actually matter. Yeah. And so it is my feeling that right now, this coming decade is potentially the highest leverage point for sort of a single individual that comes up with some of these ideas potentially ever in history. And, there's no guarantee of this. And the smart money is that anybody setting out to do this won't come up with those particular ideas. But the chance is there, and I don't think the chance is insignificant. And so because I'm in this position where I can afford to kind of throw the next decade of my life at this is kind of the play I made. Now, as you know, I was right on the edge there where it's like I could go lead VR for a decade to try and do what I thought would be a very high probability outcome of like, I'm damn near positive that I could make huge differences in that area, while I'm only barely credibly considering the ability that I could make one of these differences here, but they have different magnitudes in the payoffs. So it's been exciting for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an interesting piece for me to think through, because you have come very far full circle in this piece where artificial intelligence today, the great breakthroughs of the last decade are a big piece of it. You've got, and they're, like you said, a handful of, in retrospect, straightforward observations, but had to be discovered through really rigorous study. The other piece is the technology itself, the data sets, the ability to compute across those data sets. Over time, I expect those requirements to go down, and we're certainly already seeing miniaturization, but we kind of have to get big before we learn how to get small in these pieces. A tremendous amount of this has been powered by GPUs. And if we didn't have those GPUs, we really would not be in the position we are, even if we had all these technical breakthroughs to speak of.
Yeah, and I do take a little manner of personal delight in the fact that, yes, these were invented to play Quake. And that really is what it comes down to.
You've come full circle, John. Like, I think of this all the time. If you hadn't pioneered 3D gaming at a time when people thought it wasn't possible, which kicked off a craze. I remember I was bringing in Voodoo FX and SLI and trying to maximize, all my frame rates when I was playing video games in the 90s. That craze around video games is what led to GPUs becoming not just super powerful, but widely accessible and relatively affordable. And that was one of the key breakthroughs. And actually, while we were setting up for this podcast, a kind of funny thing John and I were talking about during the pandemic, I've spent a lot of time on Zoom meetings, and my Zoom meeting experience is way better because of game streaming. Game streamers have really created a market for things like better camera setups, better lighting setups. I've used an Elgato, Stream Deck to do switching for audio inputs and different things. And a lot of times it is finding small markets, even niche markets that are rabid and that improve things in a tight loop leads to these unexpected outcomes on the other side that you just never anticipated.
That's one of my topics that you've heard me go on so much about, like the gradient of improvement. So much more happens with local improvements than people are willing to give it credit. Everyone wants to be this far-sighted visionary, which almost by the literal reading of that means you're not looking where you are, you're looking way far ahead.
Yeah.
But the reality of this, and so much of the machine learning advances come down to just really embracing this in your soul, that like local improvements can lead you to far better results than you are likely to believe from sort of the cultural biases that we soak up. And the idea of you say, yeah, people that are Twitch streamers or YouTube producers, they have such tight feedback loops
That's right.
about it's not like making this season's production, it's making this morning's production. And they are going to have so much more valuable input into the process of improving these things. So yeah, the fact that the business, we had decades of video conferencing with your big Cisco systems that you pay tons of money for in your businesses, and they improved over time. But yeah, you saw far more improvement, far faster from the people where we got millions of people that became their own producers and were looking for the competition among 20 different companies for what's going to be the best thing to help them do their new job. And it's amazing. And again, there's deep, important lessons for people to internalize about that.
Yeah, this is a lesson that, John, you really instilled for all of us, is just the importance of following local gradients. You don't have to be clever. You can just actually really, especially once we got Quest and Quest 2 into market, it was like, hey, what are the people asking for? Can we give it to them? And like, if the answer is yes, then like do that. That's a pretty good start to getting yourself onto these steeper parts of the gradient where you can iterate really quickly and find, ever increasing fonts of value.
But it is surprising how many people don't want to listen to their users and don't want to like look down right at their feet on the value space where, like we had this all the Oculus Voice stuff where it would just kill me that I would go in and personally sort of triage the top 100 out of all of this and say, it's like, why aren't we doing all of these? Look, this one's easy. Yeah, this one would be really hard. I understand why we're not doing that. But here and here, it's like, just go fix those right now.
And we are still working on it. For those who are listening and curious, John does still occasionally send me a bug report. We fixed that graphics one, by the way, just FYI, that we get that tied up.
As a counterpoint, just last night, like I finished playing Beat Saber with my girlfriend. We returned to home. We sit down on the floor to rest a little bit. Head dips down. That's not updated and fixed yet. And that's 2 months after response. If it's fixed and in the pipeline, that's not bad. But
I think it's in the pipeline. Pipeline. Dang it.
But don't soft goal yourself. Look back to like you were there when Facebook was fixing things in production, like the day of bug reports.
It was the best.
It's not, the golden age that we can never return to. It's like there are processes that could allow us to kind of make fixes close to that scale.
Yeah, and I do think that one of the things that we are focusing on this year is just improving the release process. I mean, so one of the things that we started, we're on the path to that, ironically, fixing the update system, which was one of the areas that you and I had focused on, in December and January when we talked. That's made a lot of progress in V49 and V50. That hopefully is a precursor to us being able to deploy these things, much closer to the fix being realized. Yeah, it's really painful to have the fix in the system internally, and it's you look at the next release and it's 6 weeks out, and that's a lot of consumers who aren't getting that value in the interim.
Yeah, and that's like the thing that I try to pitch a lot about. Think about integrating all the user value from all of your customers, and time matters. And that's one of the things that I've got this famous quote about the old days about saying the games will be done when it's done. And I walk back from that a fair amount because time really is critical in almost everything you do. It's not the value at a given point, it's the value over time, integrated by everybody that's using it, everybody that's getting value to it. So there should be an urgency where if you can make it better, making it better sooner is better than making it better later.
That's right. Yeah. Shipping is a feature. Sense of urgency that we work with is such a tremendous value. And it was one of the driving forces, not just of Facebook, but the internet for such a long period of time. The internet unlocked this unbelievable cycle of consumer feedback to product improvement that was just not possible in like a shrink wrapped software era. When it was really expensive to have those bits be wrong. It's just like it's cheap now to have bits be wrong. Certain bits, most of the bits are cheap.
And it's also one of those miracles of markets where, the fact that, the steady old company doesn't feel like they need to run that hard on there. Well, they've got a really good chance of being cut off at the knees by some, upstart that is willing to hustle at that speed.
Yeah, totally. I want to avoid AI punditry, as you put it very cleverly. I think there is a lot. There's plenty of it. It's in ready supply on the internet. We don't need to contribute to it. I did want to ask if there were things about generative AIs, today's generative AIs, which is not the major focus for you, that you are excited about, that feel like, wow, that's a cool, promising gradient to go climb.
Yeah, I do think that it's really amazing where the things that we're seeing in the image and text generation, where it's amusing now to look at the people that are trying desperately to somehow say this isn't amazing, because it's amazing. It's like obviously amazing to anybody that looks at it with a reasonably open mind. And it was interesting how the image generation made much more of a splash than the text generation, where, in some ways the text generation is maybe, more along the path of intelligence, but the image generation, everybody could just glance at one of these and say, wow, that's really badass art. And It was created from this, just little text prompt from something. And then it's been really good to see, like, the way the ecosystem of the generative art especially has been very interesting, because you have the big research companies where, Meta has image generation capability, and Google and OpenAI and all the big labs had their research work that they would write papers about, and they generated sets of interesting images. But it got really exciting when you had sort of the scrappy startup company with Midjourney that goes out and says, it's like, no, we're going to solve people's problems. We're not just saying, here's the pixel perplexity of the image that we're generating, comparing against benchmarks. We're going to go out and we're going to make hundreds of millions of dollars of value for the people that consume images in the different ways. And then you had Stable Diffusion, which wound up being an approachable model that could be run by individuals, that opened it up to just like, another 2 orders of magnitude of different possible opportunities. So that's been really exciting. But then it's also been sort of culturally interesting looking at the kind of backlash that comes from this, where there was surprisingly little about it on the text generation. People talked about propaganda and misinformation, but it wasn't so much the writers in revolt. But the response from artists has been a lot more strident, where they're really concerned about it, and they're trying to organize boycotts and trying to set up technical measures so that these things, can't benefit from their work in some ways. And I definitely have some mixed feelings about the way that all played out, where on the one hand, I do feel for craftsmen, the idea that you've got a specific craft that you're doing, and you just love the craft itself even more than necessarily what you're producing. And I have some of that with programming, where a week doesn't go by where I don't sometimes wish that I could just go back and bang out 1,000 lines of C++ code to just go make some things happen for a specific reason, because I just love that process of doing things. But I always look back to, in the early days, I had a friend that was an ace assembly language programmer, and he just didn't like high-level languages. He loved assembly, and he was great at it, but he wasn't willing to kind of take the next tool there. And he had to deal with the fact that lesser programmers were outproducing him significantly by using better tools. And people look at it now, well, okay, now programmers are worried about being replaced by different things, because it's not just you banging out all the JavaScript code for this. You can now prompt Copilot or something to start building some of the code for you. And some people that are just in love with the craft are going to be a little sad about that. But that is just the reality of the way things have gone. And it does kind of get to, I don't have much sympathy for the Luddite view of, this is our craft, this is what my father did before me and what my children will do after me. It's like, no, that's not the world anymore. You need to be more flexible, but it leads to better aggregate outcomes for the entire world.
Yeah, kind of like you. And I think this is, broadly speaking, been my reaction to a lot of the AI punditry, is I'm like, this is the world. Like, these tools are here, and there's clearly a demand for them. People want to create great art. And yes, you used to have to invest in decades of paintbrush and paint experience to be able to do that. And now you don't. And I understand the sense of loss that people may feel around the artistry, but this is art moves forward. I'm an avid photographer, and I'm a student of photography. And if you go back to the turn of the last century, photography was the exact, almost verbatim source of consternation for artists. And at first, photographers adopted a very pictorialist style to try to emulate painters. Ansel Adams and the F-64 group made a very photorealistic style. They advanced that as true art, which previously had been thought of as almost documentary. And then almost certainly the modernist painting movement in the middle of the last century was a consequence of, hey, photography exists now, and like we have to do something completely different. And that's been an incredibly powerful movement that brought a lot of new voices into art. I just think, like, art is constantly on fire. It's constantly changing and evolving. and new tools are one of the major driving forces of it.
Yeah, I do chuckle a little at the irony sometimes where I see these totally amazing Photoshop artists, that they do this incredible stuff in Photoshop, and now they're like all up in arms about how AI stuff is going there. And it's like back there's some traditional artist mixing his own oil paints that's just shaking his head at you.
That's right. Yeah, and I value all of it. Like I value art of all kinds and all types. But like, I don't consider new art to come at the expense of old art. I think it's just like you have to integrate these things. I will say one kind of funny note for me on this is the degree to which I think the image-based generation, while it's controversial, certainly among those spheres, you're right, it's also just like less likely, like it doesn't know what it means to be wrong in an image. Like they can't get hands. Okay, who cares? Like hands aren't the point of this image in the first place. Whereas when the text for like a search result is wrong, like that's a search for truth, and there's a risk there. I love that for us actually at Meta, because we're doing a big generative AI push. We have a great team there. We've had state-of-the-art models for a long time. Now we're doing the work around reinforcement learning and human feedback and infrastructure and inference to get them to be production scalable systems. And I like a lot of our use cases are relatively low impact. It's like, hey, I want my avatar to have a cool t-shirt. I can describe the t-shirt to you. If it's kind of wrong, like nobody's harmed in the digital manufacture of that t-shirt. Whereas if I'm trying to give you data, like information, and that's wrong, that could have, concerns. So I think the other piece I like about the image aspects of these language models and their deployment, or the image models, I should say, and their deployment, is that like they're relatively low impact. Like they're just like, they're fun and they're potentially interesting and exciting, but like it's hard to imagine the specific harm that comes from them with, the moderate protections around things like generating deep fakes and things like that.
Yeah, and that's also one of the things that that is going to be a little bit interesting, seeing how it shakes out, where a lot of people think that clearly there's billions of dollars to be made with AI, eventually trillions. It's going to be enormous. But things like image generation, these are very small, low margin things. Like the value of an image, it's an amazing thing in our world where people used to travel to go to a museum to see one beautiful painting, but now scrolling through Instagram, you just pass through 100 beautiful images in your morning, and they're worth relatively little to you in the larger scheme of things. So even creating, your heart's desire and all of the images there, it's not going to be like, to pull this around to virtual reality. Like we should have this world where you can generate exactly the environment that you want to be in, your perfect home environment. But that's not worth all that much in the larger scheme of things, where it still bothers me how little we've been able to capitalize on just like all the 360 photos and the media, where the presentation for things, going back to the Instagrams and TikToks of the world, it's being able to go through those in this perfectly seamless way, and seeing hundreds and hundreds of these things that creates this large aggregate value. And that was something where you're not, we never got to this point in VR where we could do that. You're not going to go launch an app just to see your AI generated environment. It's not going to be enough value to get over that hump there. But if you can turn it into, it's like, well, this is your background environment for your home. There's some clear value there, where some kind of a construction studio for that has value. But that gets into the other side, where just this morning, somebody was hitting me up for questions about like, how much harder is it to do 3D modeling generative than images? And it's a good chunk harder, but then you get back into the training set problem, where imagery and labeled imagery and all the different things for that has been such a huge boon to that, where it's going to be harder to do that with models. And then you kind of segue into the NeRF direct rendering of environments, bypassing models altogether, which is interesting, fascinating stuff, but we're a full order of magnitude away from performance being able to do that real time on mobile hardware, at least. So there's all of these things where, yes, generative AI will change all these things eventually. But what I'm seeing so much now with the current frothy hype about AI is there are so many people that are overestimating how quickly things are going to change, whether it's in specific businesses or consumer behaviors. 5 years goes by in the blink of an eye, and people that are just thinking that the world's going to end in 5 years or all the jobs are going to be displaced, it's just not real like that.
Yeah, the old adage in our industry, a lot less happens in 1 year than we think, and a lot more happens in 10 years than we think. And it's just, every time I look at it, it's just been this really almost invariant that I've found to be so true. There will be a few industries profoundly impacted in the very near term, a small number of industries. 10 years is the window that I expect the more profound change to happen. And also, consumers just don't change behaviors that fast. That's the other thing that we kind of forget, especially those of us living on the leading edge of technology who are adopting every new thing. We're the outliers, and we're important, and we pioneer pieces of it, and like we get to shape how it plays. But like the average consumer behavior just doesn't change that quickly. It changes more slowly over a longer period of time. Well, this is like an unexpectedly nice little cross ramp from an AI discussion to VR. I do think the holodeck, that we all, grew up with Star Trek, kind of lusting after, feels more and more possible for VR every day, where you could verbally describe, hey, I want to be in Sherwood Forest. Nope, I want that to be a hill. No, put me in the forest. I want to be in this kind of an outfit. It does feel like we could take a lot of what is currently a pretty painful and kind of robust content creation experience and make it pretty seamless and human in the loop, which is such a fun place for us to think about VR.
Yeah, and so that is a perfect sort of example to talk about a lot of like the tension, some of the deep tensions that we have about things on the relative near scale versus far scale, where that's exactly, you probably already have a team spun up to go be doing this like vast future distance stuff, working on nerf rendering and generation of all this stuff, because that's the type of thing that just happens inside Meta. But I would, like if I was still there, I'd be arguing that, well, this probably isn't going to be the most effective way to even get there. And that was, what my whole bit about, setting out to build the metaverse probably isn't even the best way to get the metaverse, where it's that whole looking past where your feet are actually setting right now. And there almost certainly are good ways to do, like if you want to take that path, then you start off, it's like, okay, let's generate 360 photos with generative imagery. We could totally do that today, and it could be valuable for people right today. You set up the social factors, so you've got the sharing hub and people being able to kind of communicate these different things easily to their friends and pass them along. And then build up, like, how do you want people to be communicating exactly what they want? What do we want to do with the guiding images and sketches and voice feedback, going ahead and taking transcription to turn it into the text model, which conditions the image generation model. So there's a ton of stuff that you could do today that still builds the same muscles that you would eventually need for, this final holodeck, while creating products and that integrated user value in the time being. But yes, the big vision there, we can see the rough outlines of that. We can imagine a world where you say, put me in a science fiction show in a ship that looks kind of like Millennium Falcon with a little bit of Battlestar Galactica mixed in. And that's the type of thing that image generators can do. And it is not a far stretch to say we could go ahead and build environments, whether conventionally modeled and textured or nerf rendered on a cloud server to project down into your headset. That all feels possible. But it is very much something that, you could have a good sized team working away for 5 years, produce zero user value from it, and then get overtaken by somebody that had been kind of like walking the local gradient, building up a user base. And that's my biggest fear with a lot of the research, where you could put tons and tons of effort into something on this big long-term plan and then turn around and say, it's like, oh, this little company we ignored, they have 50 million users now because they've been kind of building up incrementally.
Yeah, no, 100%. And for those who are curious, following along, though John and I do disagree on the allocation, we don't disagree in principle. I think for me, I always approach things as a portfolio of investments. And so you really want to have 70 to 80% of your effort on what is the local gradient? Like, what is the thing that provides immediate consumer value that you can provide, and that's going to grow your market. It's going to grow the market for your developers, to grow the ecosystem, and that is longevity, and that's value, real value creation. And then I have, some portion that is, hey, what's next, looking a little bit longer term, but hopefully still relatively practical. We know we can do it. We believe it will be valuable. And then some percentage that is truly, someone working on holodeck. I don't currently have a holodeck team, John, although maybe after this conversation I will, but I don't currently have a team doing that. Hacker culture is still alive and well at Meta. We actually had somebody a couple weeks ago throw up some really cool rendered environments for the shell that they had generated through large language models, which is really cool. So we still want to create that space for people to explore internally. But John and I just disagree on the allocation between those buckets. That's the main.
I think about that a lot because one of the things where it's undeniable that so many things follow this power law distribution on returns. I mean, that's just the way so many things are, where you get your extreme success and then you have all this long tail of things that just didn't really work out. So there's a totally legit argument to say, well, you should just try a whole bunch of things because it's more important to get that one winner to find that spot of the solution space. And even if you just go and you're ruthless and you make all the users pissed off at you because you cancel their projects over and over, but if you get that winner, you still come out having done the right thing and you're the titan of whatever the next generation of things are. And I do struggle with that because I have a lot of internal biases about how so many of these important things also come from the very fine details where Facebook and Google, some of the big titans here, a lot of their value is because they are super fast and they are super polished and they do some of these things extremely well. It's not the checkbox set of features that the original designer came up with. It is the implementation. So, I mean, I do think that if people are throwing darts at the solution space all over the place, that won't get them to the winner because even if you're 10% off the peak there, you still need to climb up that peak doing these, really strong focused local improvements. But there's definitely something there that I'm still not completely at peace with myself about how the right way to do that works out because in fact, it comes down to one of the most fundamental questions about artificial intelligence, at least in reinforcement learning, where you have exploration and exploitation, where if you get into something that's working really well, you want to exploit that value, but you still need to explore to go ahead and make it better. And sometimes the exploration needs to be discontinuous. It needs be just this noisy, random jump to another part of the solution space, not just the little local hill climbing. But I fight against I just think that most institutions have far more of a bias to the planning and the large jumps versus just make it better over and over, repeat.
Yeah, it's funny. A little known fact: I wrote my undergraduate thesis on various constraint satisfaction optimization solving, and I had mine was a very mildly novel version of it, where we had random restart, but teams could share promising information. So much of the algorithm that is appropriate depends on the contours of the landscape. If you have very far apart, very steep peaks in your landscape, then you need a combination of iterative, deepening, some kind of hill climbing, gradient, ascent, and also random restart. And you need to get lucky in its time that just yields it. A lot of things don't have that property. A lot of things just it's like Earth. It's there's a few big mountains. You climb them, and then when you get to the top, you can jump someplace else and have the luxury of doing that. We are in some unusually steep terrain here, in my experience.
And the interesting thing about that's another one of those wasn't really deeply understood even a decade ago when people were just still scratching their heads about how can deep learning even work. And the real answer is that the higher the dimensionality of the space, the less need you have for all of these other schemes about restarting and jumping around, because everybody imagines the little 2D map of the mountains, your topographical map. And in 2D, it's trivial to get stuck in a little, in a little basin that's a local minimum. But every dimension you add just makes one more way that you can roll off of it. And if you're looking at, certainly in the modern world of billions of dimensions, it's there are no local minimums. There just really aren't. You can just always go down further. But even just going to the point of a product where you might have 10 or 20 different things that people find valuable and looking at that, 10 or 20 dimensions still means you're probably not stuck in a local optimum. You can probably still locally roll your way to a better solution, even with that small number. It's only when you come down to these 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions where you start really worrying about sort of the topography of your solution space.
Yeah, this is I hope people who are listening get a real sense of this. One of my favorite things working with you, John, they say, never meet your heroes, and I hate to say that I've done so, and it was actually delightful, is that you are unexpected in this way. You really are all about the value created. Thinking about the integral of value over time and pursuing the solution that gets you there. Computer programming happened to have been, the one that powered you early and now again late in your career, but you've gone through lots of different pieces like this. And it's truly a delight. It's a way of thinking. It's got nothing to do with software per se. It has to do with how you think about problems and the space of problems and the best way to navigate to a solution that builds value for people. It's a thing that I suspect most who've never worked with you would never know, and I'm glad to kind of expose it a little bit here. Actually, there's two other pieces that are kind of related to this. First of all, I do want to talk about your profound and important belief to you that we should preserve content, artistic content, video games. It's something that you've put money into in a foundation that preserves video games over time. We've tried to invest to unlock things like Oculus Go to make sure that people who had that platform could continue to experience that platform even after it wasn't supported by us anymore. And this came to a head recently with the Echo VR piece, where we felt we basically just from providing the best value to the most people, we couldn't maintain this thing because of its architecture being server side. There wasn't easy path, and there's a bunch of pretty annoying things around licensing issues that cause us to not be able to open source it productively. And this really offends you when software becomes unavailable. I think it's one of those things that I think is probably underappreciated in our current era, is the degree of which video games represent art. They represent content type. You've compared it to a novel suddenly being unavailable anywhere for anyone to read, off of just disappeared from the earth. Talk to me about how you think about this space and what we should do about it as an industry.
So I do see, I'm certainly sympathetic to the position that companies are in maintaining things, and especially at Meta, where the cost of maintenance is very high. And I mean, I think we had a good exchange about, there's reasons for all of this. But I still would have tried to go a little bit differently, or at least in the future, think back to this, where this has got to be a little bit painful. You have 20 or 30,000 people that are kind of pissed off at you, and
they're very pissed off. They're big mad, actually. Correction, they are extremely pissed off at me.
And that should weigh a little bit on you, because again, you're serving the users, and I know the calculation in your mind, the way it goes. Like right now, Meta's putting all of these resources into it, and you really think that those people can probably generate more value for the broader world if they're working on something else. And everybody that is an Echo fan should at least be able to kind of wrap their head around that calculation. Somebody's doing that, and it's not personal. They are working for the broader kind of set of VR world. But I do think it is fundamentally bad. I mean, I don't want to overreach and call it a moral issue, but it strikes me that way, where anybody that's heard about the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and it's just all of the classic texts that were just lost there, and you just look back at that and say, the world is poorer for having lost that information, and to have things be gone forever, it's a bad thing. I want to save everything. And I know there are people that do kind of take that other point. The Internet Archive people hear it all the time. Now, some people don't even specifically want things to go away. Oh, I don't want that embarrassing conversation I had on the news group 20 years ago to be preserved forever. And then a lot of people just take the judgmental position that all of this is crap. Who cares? Yes, we'll save our masterpieces. But the truth is, you don't know what your masterpieces are at the time. That's only seen in hindsight. And often the things that build upon each other and lead up to the important critical masterpieces, it's nice for people to be able to go back and trace the evolution of things there. And just that sense of, we should care about our history. And it's one thing for even just to save the dead books. I mean, yes, I'm the type of person, I have the books that I read as a teenager. I never throw any printed matter away, really. I've got literally a ton of printed matter. And most people aren't like that. They'll read something, they'll throw it away. But I think most people should feel some little sense that that old thing, that it shouldn't just be gone, lost to history. We have the ability to preserve all of these digital things, but it won't happen automatically. It's fantastic that we have the emulator scene, and that all of those games that you might have played when you were a little tiny kid, that you can go and bring it back up on your screen and in MAME or something. And that's great. But all of these things that became server side and that required companies to actively put resources into just keeping them alive, we're going to have this big dead zone where everybody could be going back oh, remember that thing we played when we were kids? And you can go back and see YouTube videos of people playing that, but you can't actually start it back up and put your hands on the controller. And it doesn't have to be like that. There are market forces that push things that way, but with modest expenditure of effort and resources, you can wind up in some place that at least has the opportunity of preserving some of it. And I do point back to my own experience with the first-person shooter games. And like at this very instant, there are people playing Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake because of some decisions that I made. And there is still a master server running in a closet in id Software that is awesome. Aggregating multiplayer games for some of these things. So it's possible to have low maintenance infrastructure. It's not the way of the world today. I mean, the way of the world today is that any infrastructure that you build is going to be a tax on everything you do going forward. But there are alternate ways of doing that. And then there are alternate ways of structuring the game so that I would like every game developer to make sure that their game can at least behave in some limited fashion when the internet is down. I mean, that's a real thing your customers will value. I mean, people do not have 3 nines internet availability, and they might want to do something with the game, even if it's just in a limited fashion there. And if you've taken that step, then at least that can survive into the future. Now, I mean, it's a harder push to say it's like, well, open source your server software, and people don't understand outside of industry how that's not as easy as, as you'd think. And I was in kind of a unique position with the early id Software stuff because I had written it in an excruciatingly portable form intentionally. And I thought about that from the beginning. And literally all I had to do was zip up the source code and it was okay to go. But again, that's not the way software is built today. It's, this, I would say, for better or worse, and I would say definitely for some worse, the cobbling together of every different dependency to make your product work. That's the way it is. It's hard to even just bundle it up. But even there, you could argue it should be in a container somewhere. You should be able to just say, here, this file is the container that runs the server. But then you get into rights restrictions, licensed code. It's challenging.
That's really what sniped us a bit on the Echo VR, which was it was like, oh, there's all these licenses where we can't even secure licenses to open source these things. It's not like the open source community would be able to either. John, you did send me some notes on development practices that we should consider in the future that will make it more future proof. Obviously, I don't want to find myself in this position again. I am heartbroken for the Echo VR community. It does weigh on me, as it should. I stand by the decision. That doesn't make it, but the mistakes were made long before. And you and I had exchanged about this where you said, maybe those mistakes were made and I understand your decision, but like in the future, don't make those mistakes. Actually, while I have you, one thing I try to do is at least untangle one technical phrase each of these times. We've been talking about neural radiance fields or NeRFs without giving much color to it. Can you give the listeners like a 2-minute understanding of what is the difference between a neural radiance field and let's say like, the way the models are running otherwise?
Sure. So in virtual reality, when you have an environment now, there's a couple ways it gets done today. The easiest way is to have an environment photo, essentially a 360 environment map, whether it's a cube map or an equirectangular image, but it's a flat image at distance. And if you have an image of like hanging from a balloon or something, it's perfect. It's super high quality. You can get it at the resolution of the screen, use a layer. It can be extremely high quality. It falls apart if you've got things in the near field, where if you've got a person right in front of you, it can be a great picture of their face. And at peak resolution, it looks quite good. It's not as good as looking at your cell phone, but it really is good enough done well. But it has none of that sense of depth and presence. Right. And every small little move that you make with your head and it doesn't respond to that, it starts being a little uncomfortable for your brain. The next step up that people would do was stereo panoramas, where you have a different one for each eye, and it's processed in a certain way where if your head is still, now you've got the sense of depth and seeing around silhouettes, and it's a little bit cool, but it's some strain on your eyes. If you tip your head, it's doing things your brain doesn't like to see, and it has its whole set of problems. Then there's the video game rendering method, where everything is broken down into a triangle skin, which has textures mapped on top of it and special effect shaders. And that's the way essentially all video games are done today. And it's the way the backgrounds in Oculus Home work. That takes very specialized content creators. And that's one of the things that I really do pat them on the back, that the team that's done the environments for Home have been almost flawless from my point of view. And that's rare to hear from me, where I'm usually nitpicking everything to death, but they've done a good job. but there's still like the texture resolution could be higher and you get little aliasing on the edges, but they had to be, handcrafted in this very specific way. And nobody mistakes them for photorealistic. They are like video game environments, but they are lovely in their own way. Now, NRFs, or neural radiance fields, is a way to take an environment or an object, and like so many of these things, you can sort of do outside in, looking at something here, or inside out, looking at the world around you. But they turn the entire presentation of the world down into the weights of a neural network. And instead of, say, drawing a triangle at a time, it's more like a ray casting operation. But instead of intersecting that ray with every triangle in your scene or using your accelerator structures, it's asking the neural network, what color should this be at this angle? Yeah. And by the magic of neural networks, it can do a very good job of interpolating between it. So you can get the different views for each eye, like the game rendering, but it can also have, like the image generator, show all of the complexity and detail of real world images. And so these can be either completely synthetic, or very appealingly, they can be extrapolated from a modest set of real world images. And this is something where for several years, Meta had a program working on very high-end 360-degree camera capture that would do all of this very careful stitching to build up depth maps. Yeah. And it's a super hard problem because it really is ill-posed. You've got a couple dozen cameras looking at things, and they try to figure out what they're all seeing together so they can calculate a depth from that. And you can do a lot of hardcore mathematics to try to find optimal solutions for this. But even throwing everything at it, it was kind of eye-opening how many areas didn't have enough texture, didn't have enough coverage, or there was too much ambiguity, and it wasn't great. And you would have these things, when you would render them, they'd kind of wiggle around in different ways. And it was, after all of that work, it had some beautiful moments, but it was surprisingly not the solution that we all hoped for, where in theory, you think every movie you've ever seen, you could watch the movie, send it into this reverse photogrammetry system, and then have a 3D model that you could walk around, walk through the Millennium Falcon after you fed it Star Wars. Yeah. And that's one of those, in theory, that's possible, but the conventional methods really did fall short of that. Yeah. And there was a conscious choice that even at the time that was going on, people knew that, okay, machine learning can probably fill in all the gaps and work this. But, and I thought it was the right decision at the time. Let's go as hard as you possibly can with conventional approaches, because machine learning is alchemy still today. Totally. You only throw alchemy at it when you've exhausted your actual algorithmic approaches.
That's right.
When you go all in on alchemy, you can do some pretty amazing things. And that's what you're seeing with some of the NRFs now, where not 20 calibrated cameras that cost $50,000 for this rig, but taking your cell phone, going around looking at all of this, and then pulling a NRF image out of it. Yeah. But to throw a little bit of cold water on that, all of these images look wonderful on Twitter when they're going by in this tiny little image. If you take that same image and you blow it up over a 4K display of a Quest 2, you start seeing a whole lot more flaws with that. Yeah. And they're rendered on much more horsepower. Again, we're an order of magnitude away from being able to render like the resolution of Quest 2 on mobile hardware. So it's a ways away, but it's possible. We are going to get another order of magnitude improvement in performance. Of course, we'll have higher resolution screens by that point also, and it's not clear that those will converge into being able to do that, but there will be great advances in distilling the NRF models. But you're going to get to this point where this glorious NRF model, this is a gigabyte download for your background, and it's static. It doesn't have all the little moving accents for things. It doesn't have collision detection for the different stuff. So it's going to be exciting, but it's not going to be as absolutely transformative until we get to closer to this decade out range, when you really do sort of have your holodeck where you say, spin this up for me with all the characteristics that I need.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's worth it. We also, even with the recorded NRFs that we have today, like relighting is a challenge. So even if you manage to get it into the headset, it's just got the same static lighting that it was kind of shot with, which is there's a bunch of, not being able to retexture things is a challenge because you don't actually have a model of the world. And that is kind of my, and for those who are listening, if you want to look up that crazy camera, we built it with Red. It's called if you Google Manifold Red, you will find the crazy details in that camera. It was an incredible,
it's an amazing piece of engineering.
It really was.
Yeah.
An unbelievable camera. I don't think we ever made more than like 3 or 4 of them, but incredible camera. But yeah, no, this is kind of a good summary on for me where a lot of machine learning is, which is there's no common sense, there's no actual model underneath it. It's all surface layer, and you can actually do an incredible amount at the surface layer. If you're, to our earlier point, if you're doing an image, if you're doing a body of text that you want to look like a credible body of text, it's really good at those superficial pieces. If you need like a common sense thing to happen, my favorite is trying to do ChatGPT math, where like there's no actual underlying theory of the world. That is one of the pieces that I'll shout out to the Facebook AI research group FAIR, which is that they are really trying to drive on world models. And which is, I think, the next generation of technology that hopefully removes some of the alchemy currently required by machine learning.
Yeah, and I do want to give a shout out also. The Facebook research, Facebook AI is underappreciated broadly because it's not Google and OpenAI, but a whole lot of really good work and good people are at work at Meta. And I did say this like directly to, I think, you and Mark about this, where, Meta's probably not going to be the AGI powerhouse of the future because there's just an optics problem of Facebook doesn't want to be seen as making our AI overlords where everybody expects Google to do that. And it does kind of guide the worldview and the internal thinking and the statements that get made by the representatives here. And I assume the work that happens, internally, where there is a little bit more of a guiding to the practical here, and not, the self-aggrandization that happens for some of the other ones, or at least that is allowed to happen in the communities around some of the other companies.
It's funny. I think Jan's he had 2 great papers this summer. One of them was really a summary of what he thinks of the future required to get to AGI. I thought it was a pioneering paper. I think it's one that we'll look back on, decades from now and say, wow, that was really, if there's a window into the future that I've seen, it's that vision. And one cool thing about our recent shift into building a generative AI product group is actually it'll kind of allows FAIR to focus a lot more on that vision and executing towards that vision. And we continue to have kind of, as I always do, John, a portfolio of investments, some group working in the distant future and some working more iteratively on what's coming up. Okay, rapid fire round, 3 rapid fire questions before we wrap up. Number 1, your vision for Quest hardware has always been light, cheap, and fast. If you had to pick one vector to push on for future VR hardware, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm not going to simplify to one dimension there because it is a distribution of stuff where I do think those are the right things there. And, we had like the predictions and we got our market test points and stuff going on right now. And I do catch myself doing that all the time, saying we when I'm talking about Meta and VR still. Yeah.
You're a permanent member, John.
But I think that, it's more broadly accepted that, yes, you want to be all of that. You want to be lightweight, comfortable. You need to be cheap. It needs to be available to everyone. But it needs to be closer. We should be still looking at the things that people do, like your cell phone or your tablet. The fact that I always tell people to make this consideration, the things that you use like that all the time. If the VR experience about how tedious it was to start or how much glitchiness there was there or the limited availability of the things you wanted to do, if that was on your phone, what would your phone be like if you had to set up an Acknowledge Guardian every time that you started it up? If you had to wait for your controllers to wake up before you could start using, doing inputs there. So getting to that point, not just, light and cheap, but it should also be instant. It should just be, you should just be able to like pull it up and put it on your head to like just glance over there to look at something as easily as you would look at your watch. I think that level of feedback and the lack of latency is critically important. But then it needs to just be able to actually do all of the things that people want to do. And I keep saying how VR needs to displace all of these other devices, where for the early adopters, the people that are at that bleeding edge, they buy everything. You get a VR headset in addition to your 2nd, 3rd, 4th TV and your tablet and your Chromebook and all of these things. But to get to the whole world, it needs to it needs to replace those things. It needs to go ahead and say, well, if you buy the VR headset, you don't need to buy this Chromebook. You can just attach a keyboard to it. You don't need to buy this extra TV. You've got your big screen theater there. You don't need this tablet. This is going to be able to run the Android apps directly there. So, and the super frustrating thing is, like, all of that's just right there for us. It's just a matter of doing it. We don't need to wait for, magical micro LED silicon carbide displays, whatever, to create this value. We just need to go do it. The programmers just need to do this instead of that. So I'm still very bullish on it's going to happen, that the value of head-mounted displays is extremely large. They can be cheaper than cell phones in some ways. They can have all of these abilities while providing the big screen value. They can have the unique advantage of virtual reality with the spatial movement and the hand tracking and the things that we're doing with that, while subsuming all of these other things. I still think it's a great bet, and that, it's Meta's to lose at this point.
What's a strong pitch? You heard it from John Carmack, not from me. 2 more questions. What is I know you're an avid reader, fiction that you think what's your best AI fiction? If someone's like, hey, I wanted to go read some science fiction that's got a great representation of AI, what's your favorite?
So this actually it just passed on Twitter this morning, topical to this question here. Somebody was mentioning the Avogadro Corp, or the Singularity series by Hartling. And that was like a decade ago. And it's pretty, I loved the books when they came out, but that was over 10 years ago. And it was very prescient how they basically had a Google stand-in company writing something that was going to help you reply to emails better with text generation. And it followed the path into sort of a textual sentience. And I thought that it was really well done. And also kind of topical in that area, more in the thriller genre of Suarez's book Damon, which was kind of a, like, after the guy died, his will lived on through this AI at more of a kind of below major societal level for a while. I thought that was great. And in more recent movies, the Ex Machina and Her were both really great, I thought. So there's I enjoy all sorts of different fiction, even when I sometimes wince at how some of the things go, but sometimes there are sparks of insight and foresight and brilliance about the way people look at the future.
I love it. And I think I haven't read all those, and now I've got a good reading list in front of me.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, last one. We talked about video games as an art form. We've seen the crossovers with things like Last of Us becoming this kind of uber popular TV series after having been one of the best games, many consider ever created. Is there a crossover you want to happen? Is there a Quake TV show? What's a crossover that should happen in your opinion? A video game story that's so good it should be on other media?
So I thought Last of Us, the TV show, was spectacular. I really loved it. And as a little side point, I think it is kind of interesting how that era of sort of 20 years ago for the disaster it's going to be kind of like some of the spy movies where you start looking back in time, because going forward, it's interesting with all of the solar power taking off everywhere and a lot of the off-grid stuff. Some of the disaster stuff is going to be more about not planting your next set of crops, but finding the off-grid solar house that has, that's already there, because that stuff works pretty well now. But so I saw the other side of this for years. The Doom movie with The Rock and Karl Urban is, it's a C-level movie in retrospect, but it was fun to have your video game turn into a superstar movie. But then there were lots of terrible, terrible video game movies. But I think, we've probably rounded a bit of a corner where they can be a little bit smarter about, how they're doing it. I'm looking forward to watching the new Super Mario Brothers movie. It looks pretty delightful for my tastes.
Yeah, totally.
But, I do keep going back to my point about, I always felt games and story were a little bit of kind of uneasy companions there, where there's no doubt that there are some great games that people just adore that were story driven. But I still think that the very best games, the most important games, the games that have impacted culture and the lives of billions of people now, they really are all about the play. And you have a setting and you wind up building lore around the game. It kind of accretes over time, but it's not necessarily something that it's at all wise to try to turn into a movie. It's like a Minecraft movie or a Fortnite movie, a Roblox movie. These are not things that are are all obviously correct, but
That's
these
right.
are sort of the titans of the modern gaming space. So I'm happy when people can go make a story-driven kind of single-player game experience. But that's a tough market to be in now. I certainly wouldn't recommend people build VR-oriented games in that way. It might be your passion project, and if you've got a patron or you're independently wealthy, then God bless you, go have a good time. But I don't recommend it as a business model. So I deeply love my stories. I have thousands and thousands of books that I've read, and 10,000 plus comic books. I love all of that, but it's separate and distinct from what gaming kind of does for me and what I think about gaming's impact on the world is.
Well, listen, I wish I had 5 hours with you, John. You have a wealth of fascinating insight into every topic we touch on. Maybe I'll get you back for future podcasts. If people want to find you, what's the best place for people to follow you on the internet? Is it Twitter, I assume?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. It's @ItAA Carmack, which is, of course, horribly outdated 4 generations back of my different technologies. And I'm a pretty regular tweeter. I do have open DMs, but it's weird where going through all of the first decade of it, I had a steady stream of incoming DMs that I would generally respond to if they had a concise answer. But oddly, as AI took off, I've just been swamped. And it's been kind of weird because it's not that many people working with AI or, even using it right now, but somehow it's been enough to have me really overloaded. So I'm not actually very good at plowing through that like I used to be now. But if it's an interesting question, hit me up publicly on Twitter. If there's other people that'll be interested in the answer, I do try to respond personally as much as I possibly can.
It's a real gift to the community. For those of you who are listening, thank you for joining. I'm glad to have you listening to Boz to the Future, wherever you enjoy fine podcasts. You can leave me thoughts and feedback at BozTank on Instagram and on Twitter, or facebook.com/Boz. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.